My name is Eleanor Sandry. I'm going to actually do this presentation, and it details some early research that I've been doing with my colleague Gwyneth Peaty at Curtin University. Today I'm going to be talking about communicating as through with a robot, so I'm going to be discussing human relations with telepresence robots. So we're using two very different telepresence robots to drive really what amounts to a number of different research projects. So SIM then, the teleport telepresence robot, is a mobile remote presence robot. Okay, so it's a robot that's described often as a machine that enables embodied video conferencing. You can see a picture here of a Beam robot, which is another type of mobile remote presence robot that you might well have seen at conferences. I know this is the one that I've actually seen in action. So I've just included that here so there's something more familiar. But if you look now, this is the teleport robot that we're using. This is SIM. So these robots allow a person not just to be virtually present in a space or to interact and socially participate from a remote location through a screen, but they also allow people to physically move in the local environment and around and with people. Haru then is a very different type of telepresence robot, a tabletop telepresence robot. So some of these sorts of robots do have screens. Others do not have a screen, but offer users a level of anonymity because they don't have a screen. They can also often provide other non-verbal communication affordances. You can see here is Ori Home, okay, which is one of the ones I mentioned in the extended abstract. But we've also then got a picture of Haru, so from Honda Research Institute. So you can see quite a complicated platform actually. Haru has an expressive mouth, animated eyes, and a neck that leans and a body that rotates. And that means that Haru can really express quite a lot of different emotions. And the design of Haru has been very much built around this sort of non-verbal communication, at least in its initial stages. And I've already written a separate paper about that, which you can find online. So Haru and SIM are definitely very different, but they both allow people to teleoperate them and communicate through them in their different ways. So if we look at ways of theorising telepresence relations, and the extended abstract does this in quite a lot more detail, we've kind of identified three different ways that you can think of telepresence and the relationship with the robot. So we have the idea of being a cyborg. This is something that Emily Dreyfus writes about in her experience with the robot she called MBot. And this idea that she becomes the robot. My head is her iPad. When she fell, I felt disoriented in Boston. When a piece of her came off in the impact, I felt broken. You can see there's a real cyborg relation. Dreyfus feels an intimate connection with this robot as if it is just an extension of her own body. If we think a little bit more generally about how telepresence works, though, it's not necessarily the case that someone is going to be using a robot exclusively for their access to a workplace. So often we have something that's a bit of a less fixed relation within which a human and robot remain separable and replaceable because the participants, the human and the robot, in fact, may change flexibly as required. So you might have more than one person dialing into one robot, you might have more than one robot available and different people using them at different times. So this less fixed relation can be thought of in terms of a human-robot assemblage. And here I'm kind of extending some work that Dant did in terms of driver-car relations, particularly with all sorts of cars. And I've actually extended that into looking at autonomous vehicles as well in some other research of mine. So I'm quite interested in that idea of the assemblage and what that brings to this is a more flexible relation, say, than the cyborg relation. When we consider some of the difficulties of using telepresence robots, we may want to retain an even greater sense of separation in the human-robot team, as it were. So because it might be useful for telepresence robots to be a bit more semi-autonomous, so to be able to control maybe the details of their movement around a space, or in the sense of a robot like Haru, be able to actually offer pre-prepared, choreographed emotive sequences, then we have a sense where the human and the robot might feel more like they're working together to produce a communicative result. They're combining their different capabilities to enable effective telepresence, whether that involves moving around a space or being on a desktop and actually really being very emotional in the presentation of that communication. So these are three different ways of kind of theorizing levels of telepresence or levels of closeness in a relation between a person and a specific robot. Now, our research is planning to use qualitative methods as its main strategy. Most of the research that we reviewed for the abstract actually used quantitative methods, in particular structured surveys, Likert scales, associated statistical analyses. And this all produces really interesting results. But I have to say that as a humanities researcher, when I read the articles that I find, I'm almost always more interested in whether or not they've used any form of qualitative methods, such as a semi-structured interview, and that some of the research even used autoethnographic methods, such as thick description. And these were the things that kind of added weight to what the research was saying, and also just gave me a sense of depth in understanding how people were experiencing telepresence. So our research is going to use both interviews and detailed personal experience accounts to kind of collect how our responses and the responses of our participants develop with both of these robots, with Sim and with Harry, even though they're very different from one another. We've identified now some potential research questions, but I think it's worth pointing out that these will be developed as we continue to work with the robots. We want to consider the perspective of remote users of the telepresence robot, so we want to think about how people perceive themselves and the robot as they move through the space. We want to think about how communication seems to work for them through this telepresence robot. How much are they thinking of themselves as the robot, communicating through the robot or communicating with it? And also we're interested in how the experience of a communicative event when using a telepresence robot compares with people's face-to-face communication experiences. We also want to look at the perspective of people sharing space with the robot to try to get a sense for how they see the telepresence robot itself, how they understand its presence operating alongside the presence of the person that's communicating through that robot. We want to understand how that interaction develops in that shared space. And we're also wondering how the existing relationship between people communicating using these robots shapes their responses. Now, previous research that we talk about in the extended abstract looks at this mainly as an effect on the person who's actually remote and using the telepresence robot. And we're also interested, though, in looking in a bit more detail at how the people around the robot, so in the same physical space as the robot, also feel, depending on how well they know the person who's using that robot. So that is really the extended abstract encapsulated in a very short presentation. I hope it's short enough. I can see already that I've gone over the 7 minutes. If you want to ask questions, you can see my email address and my Twitter handle here. And of course, there'll be space through the ICA conference interface also to ask questions if you have them. Thank you for listening.